Nothing cuts deeper than watching someone hurt the person who raised you. There's a rage that burns in your chest when a coward strikes down the gentle hands that once soothed your childhood fears. In 9th century Norway, Astrid the Wise had guided her village through 60 harsh winters. Her granddaughter Freydis loved her with the fierce devotion only family can understand. When Astrid was brutally attacked in her own home, Freydis's cry for justice echoed across the fjords. The village warriors knew Astrid well. She had healed their wounds and blessed their weapons before countless battles. Now they gathered outside her longhouse, ready to defend the woman who had always defended them. But the attacker wasn't just anyone. He was a chieftain's son, and seeking revenge could tear their world apart. What happens when protecting your family means destroying your community? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants, drifting between the wooden longhouses of Ironfjord as the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. This was the hour when the village belonged to the old and the early risers, when the only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves against the stone harbour and the soft murmur of prayers from those who still remembered the ancient ways. Astrid the Wise moved through her longhouse with the quiet grace of someone who had spent 60 winters learning the rhythm of life and death. Her hands, weathered but steady, gathered the scattered healing runes from their wooden box, smooth stones, carved with symbols passed down through generations of wise women. Each rune held power, not in magic but in memory, in the accumulated wisdom of countless grandmothers who had guided their people through plague, famine, and the endless cycle of seasons. The longhouse itself stood as a testament to Astrid's place in the community. Larger than most homes, but smaller than the Jarl's Great Hall, it occupied the spiritual heart of Ironfjord. The walls, darkened by decades of hearth smoke, were hung with bundles of dried herbs, chamomile for restless sleep, willow bark for pain, yarrow for wounds that refused to heal. Clay pots lined wooden shelves, filled with remedies that had saved more lives than any warrior's sword. This was where mothers brought fevered children in the dark, hours before dawn. Where young men came seeking counsel before their first raids, where the elderly gathered to share stories and seek comfort for aches that no herb could cure. The longhouse wasn't just Astrid's home, it was the village's sanctuary, a place where the harsh realities of Viking life softened into something bearable. Freydis had awakened before sunrise, as was her custom. At 19, she possessed the restless energy of youth, tempered by an old soul's wisdom. Her grandmother had raised her from childhood, teaching her not only the arts of healing and prophecy, but also the skills of a shield maiden. The young woman could read the healing runes as easily as she could wield a sword, could brew remedies for heartbreak as skillfully as she could mend a shield split in battle. She moved through the longhouse with purposeful steps, her long blonde hair braided with leather cords in the manner of unmarried women. Her frame was lean and strong from years of training, her hands calloused from both swordwork and grinding herbs. The villagers often remarked that she had inherited her grandmother's gift for seeing into hearts, combined with the fierce protectiveness of a she-wolf defending her den. "Grandmother," Freydis called softly as she entered the main room, where embers still glowed in the central hearth. "The council meeting isn't until midday. You should rest longer." Astrid looked up from her runes, her pale blue eyes still sharp, despite the lines that mapped a lifetime of laughter and sorrow across her face. Her silver hair, braided and pinned in the style of a matron, caught the firelight like spun moonbeams. "Rest is for those who have nothing left to give, child. These old bones have work to do yet." The relationship between grandmother and granddaughter was one of those rare bonds that transcended the usual boundaries between generations. They were more like sisters, separated by decades, united by shared purpose and mutual respect. Freydis had never known her parents. They had died in a raid when she was barely old enough to walk, but Astrid's love had filled that void so completely that she had never felt orphaned. "The Eriksson boy was asking about you again yesterday," Astrid said with the hint of a smile, referring to Bjorn, the blacksmith's eldest son. "He's been hovering around our door like a lost puppy for weeks." Freydis felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Bjorn is a Kristit, good man, strong, honest, skilled at his craft. But," Astrid's eyebrow arched with knowing amusement, "but I'm not ready for that path yet. There's still so much to learn from you, so much I need to understand about our ways." Astrid nodded approvingly. She had married young herself, borne children, and loved deeply. But she had also learned that a woman's strength came not from the man beside her, but from the wisdom within her. "The heart knows its own seasons, child. When the time is right, you'll know." The morning routine continued with the comfortable rhythm of long habit. Freydis tended the hearth while Astrid prepared the day's remedies. Soon the village would wake fully, and their door would open to the endless stream of those seeking help, guidance, or simply a listening ear. It was a life of service that both women embraced, understanding that their gifts were not their own, but belonged to the community. Outside, the village stirred to life. Fjord was a prosperous settlement, blessed with a natural harbour that provided excellent fishing and protected anchorage for trading vessels. The houses, built of sturdy oak and pine, stood in rough rows leading up from the waterfront. Smoke began to rise from cooking fires as families prepared their morning meals. Children's voices carried on the morning air as they began their daily chores, feeding livestock, gathering eggs, helping with the endless tasks that sustained their community. The village supported perhaps 300 souls, enough to provide security and prosperity, but small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business. There were the fishermen who brought in the daily catch, the farmers who worked the limited arable land beyond the village, the craftsmen who created everything from ships to jewelry. At the center of it all stood Jarl Erik's great hall, where important decisions were made and justice dispensed. Jarl Erik himself was a man in his middle years, still strong enough to lead warriors into battle, but wise enough to seek counsel before making important decisions. He had ruled Fjord for nearly 2 decades, guiding the village through periods of both prosperity and hardship. His relationship with Astrid was one of mutual respect. He valued her wisdom, and she appreciated his steady leadership. The Jarl's family included his wife Ingrid, a capable woman who managed the great hall with efficiency and grace, and their son Magnus. At 22, Magnus was everything a Viking chieftain's heir should be: tall, strong, skilled with weapons, and possessed of the confidence that came from a lifetime of privilege. Yet there were those in the village who whispered that his confidence sometimes bordered on arrogance, that his strength was occasionally used to intimidate rather than protect. But these were whispers, easily dismissed in a community where loyalty to leadership was essential for survival. Magnus was expected to inherit his father's position eventually, and most villagers assumed he would grow into the role as his father had before him. The morning continued peacefully, with Astrid and Freydis receiving their usual visitors. Old Henrik came seeking relief for joints that ached with the changing weather. Young Solveig brought her teething infant, desperate for something to ease the child's crying. The baker's wife stopped by for herbs to help with her husband's persistent cough. Each visitor was welcomed with patience and compassion. Astrid would listen carefully to their concerns, asking questions that often revealed more than the symptoms they described. She understood that healing often began with being truly heard, truly seen. Freydis watched and learned, absorbing not just the knowledge of herbs and remedies, but the deeper wisdom of human nature. "Remember," Astrid would often tell her granddaughter, "we treat not just the body but the spirit. A broken heart can manifest as a broken body. Fear can make wounds fester. Hope can heal what medicine cannot touch." It was this holistic approach that made Astrid so valued in the community. She was more than a healer, she was a counselor, a spiritual guide, a keeper of wisdom. Men who would never admit weakness to their peers could find strength in her presence. Women struggling with the burdens of family and survival could discover hope in her words. The Longhouse itself reflected this dual nature of Astrid's calling. One corner was devoted to healing shelves of herbs, grinding stones, ceramic vessels for brewing remedies. Another corner held the tools of divination and spiritual guidance, rune stones, carved idols of the old gods, ritual objects passed down through generations of wise women. The central hearth served as the heart of both functions. Here, remedies were prepared and prayers offered. Here, visitors could warm themselves while sharing their troubles. Here, Freydis had spent countless evenings listening to her grandmother's stories, learning the oral history that was every bit as important as written knowledge. As the morning progressed toward midday, the pace of visitors slowed. Astrid settled into her favorite chair, a sturdy piece of oak carved with protective symbols. Freydis busied herself organizing their supplies, a task that was never truly finished but provided a meditative rhythm to quiet moments. "Tell me again about the old alliance," Freydis said, referring to one of her favorite stories from her grandmother's youth. Astrid smiled, recognizing the request for what it was, not a desire to hear the tale again, but a need for the comfort that came from shared ritual. "Ah, you mean the summer, when the three clans put aside their feuds to face the raiders from the north?" "Yes, that one. Tell me about how wisdom triumphed over pride." And so Astrid began the familiar tale, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a practiced storyteller. It was a story of cooperation, of overcoming conflict, of leaders who chose the welfare of their people over personal glory. It was a story with lessons that would prove more relevant than either woman could have imagined, as that peaceful morning wore on toward an afternoon that would change everything. The sunlight streaming through the Longhouse windows grew stronger, warming the wooden floors and casting dancing shadows as clouds passed overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn sounded as a trading vessel prepared to depart. Life in Fjord continued its ancient rhythm, peaceful and predictable. Neither Astrid nor Freydis could have known that within hours their world would be shattered by an act of violence that would test everything they believed about justice, family, and the bonds that held their community together. The healing runes scattered carelessly across Astrid's table would soon be scattered again, this time by hands, driven not by morning routine, but by rage and fear. But for now, in this last hour of innocence, grandmother and granddaughter shared stories and prepared remedies. Surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of generations and protected by the love that had sustained them through 19 years of joys and sorrows. The Longhouse held them in its embrace, solid and secure, a sanctuary that had never been violated. Soon, that sanctuary would become a battlefield, and the two women who had devoted their lives to healing would find themselves at the center of a conflict that would force them to choose between forgiveness and justice, between peace and the fierce loyalty that bound family together with chains stronger than iron. The attack came without warning, like a summer storm that strikes from a cloudless sky. Astrid had been alone in the Longhouse when Magnus Eriksson arrived. Freydis had gone to the harbour to gather seaweed for brewing a task that should have taken no more than an hour, but had stretched longer as she stopped to help mend fishing nets and listen to tales from the morning's catch. It was the kind of delay that, in hindsight, would haunt her for years to come. Magnus entered without the courtesy of announcing himself, a breach of etiquette that immediately set Astrid on edge. She had known this young man since his birth, had delivered him into the world with her own hands, had treated his childhood fevers and blessed him before his first hunt. But the man who stood in her doorway bore little resemblance to the child she remembered. "Magnus," she said carefully, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested on his sword hilt. "Your father is well, I hope. You seem troubled." "Don't," His voice carried a harshness she had never heard before. "Don't pretend you don't know why I'm here." Astrid rose slowly from her chair, her mind racing through possibilities. Had someone spread rumors? Had old grievances finally surfaced? She had lived long enough to know that the past had a way of reaching forward with grasping fingers, but she couldn't fathom what could have brought such rage to Magnus's eyes. "I know many things, child, but I don't know what brings you to my door with anger in your heart. Sit. Let me brew something to calm your spirit." "I said don't." Magnus stepped further into the longhouse, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "I found them. Astrid, the letters, hidden in my father's chest like guilty secrets." Understanding struck her like a physical blow. The letters, those carefully preserved fragments of a past she had tried to bury, written in her younger hand to Eric during the winter when his first wife lay dying, when grief and loneliness had driven them both to seek comfort in each other's arms. Letters that should have been burned decades ago but had been kept, perhaps as treasures, perhaps as weapons. "Magnus, you don't understand. I understand perfectly." He advanced toward her, his face twisted with a fury that seemed to consume all the light in the room. "You bewitched him. You made him betray his dying wife with your sorcery." "There was no sorcery, only two people trying to survive a harsh winter and finding solace in lies." Magnus's hand shot out, striking her across the face with such force that she stumbled backward into her workbench. Clay pots crashed to the floor, sending herbs and remedies scattering across the wooden planks. The healing runes, her most precious possessions, scattered like broken promises. Astrid tasted blood on her lips, felt the sharp sting where his ring had cut her cheek. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the anguish of seeing this young man, this child she had helped raise, consumed by a hatred she had never imagined possible. 30 years, Magnus snarled, following her as she tried to regain her footing. 30 years you've sat in judgment of this village, dispensing your wisdom, acting like some holy woman. But I know what you really are. Magnus, please, she raised, her hands, not in defense, but in supplication. Your father and I, what happened between us was a lifetime ago. It hurt no one. Your parents found happiness together. My mother lived in the shadow of a whore's memory. His second blow caught her temple, sending her crashing into the central hearth. The edge of the stone fireplace struck her ribs with a crack that echoed through the longhouse. Every kindness he showed you, every courtesy, every moment of respect, it was all stolen from her. Astrid tried to speak, tried to explain, but Magnus was beyond hearing. Years of buried resentment, of imagined slights and whispered doubts had crystallized into this moment of pure rage. He grabbed a heavy wooden stool and raised it above his head. You think your granddaughter will mourn you? The stool came down across her back as she tried to crawl away from the hearth. She'll learn the truth about what you really are, what you've always been. The blows continued, each one punctuated by accusations that grew more wild and incoherent. Astrid curled herself into a protective ball, trying to shield her head, while Magnus vented decades of imagined wrongs. Through the haze of pain, she found herself thinking not of her own suffering, but of Freydis, sweet, fierce Freydis, who would return to find this devastation. Please, she whispered through lips that were swollen and bleeding. Please, Magnus, if you must punish someone for the past, punish me, but don't destroy your future. Don't destroy the village's future. For a moment, the beating stopped. Magnus stood over her, breathing heavily, the wooden stool still gripped in his hands. In that pause, Astrid dared to hope that reason might return, that the young man she had once known might resurface from beneath his rage. Instead, she saw something worse than fury in his eyes, a cold satisfaction, as if her pain had fed some hungry thing inside him. This isn't about punishment, he said quietly. This is about truth, about making sure everyone knows what their beloved wise woman really is. He dropped the stool and turned toward her workbench, sweeping his arm across the carefully organized shelves. Jars of herbs crashed to the floor, mixing healing remedies with broken clay. Sacred objects, passed down through generations of wise women, were scattered and trampled underfoot. But it was what he did next that truly broke Astrid's heart. From his belt, he drew a small silver arm ring, the mark of his family's authority, and deliberately placed it near the door, where it would be easily found. The ring bore the carved raven of Eric's lineage, an unmistakable signature that would ensure everyone knew who had been here. "Let them come looking for justice," Magnus said, his voice now eerily calm. "Let them demand satisfaction from my father's house. We'll see how far their loyalty to you extends when it means war between the clans." He paused at the threshold, looking back at the wreckage he had created. Astrid lay among the scattered runes and broken pottery, her silver hair stained with blood, her breathing shallow and pained. The Longhouse that had been a sanctuary for 60 years now looked like a battlefield. "You should have burned those letters," Magnus said. "You should have let the past stay buried." Then he was gone, leaving Astrid alone with her pain and the terrible certainty that this was only the beginning. The attack itself had been brutal, but the real devastation would come when Freydis returned. When the village learned what had happened. When the impossible choice between justice and peace tore their community apart. Astrid tried to rise, but found her legs wouldn't support her weight. Her ribs burned with each breath, and there was a ringing in her ears that spoke of serious injury. She managed to drag herself to where the healing runes lay scattered, gathering a few of the unbroken stones to her chest, like talismans against the darkness, closing in around her. Outside, the afternoon continued peacefully, unaware that the foundation of Fjord's harmony had just been shattered by one man's rage and a woman's refusal to let the past remain buried. Soon, Freydis would return from the harbour with seaweed for brewing. Soon, she would find her grandmother broken and bleeding among the ruins of their sanctuary. And then, the real reckoning would begin. The scream that tore from Freydis's throat when she found her grandmother could be heard across half the village. It was a sound of pure anguish, the cry of someone whose world had just collapsed into ruins. Within moments, that terrible wail brought people running from every direction, fishermen dropping their nets, craftsmen abandoning their tools, mothers clutching children to their chests as they hurried toward the Longhouse. Freydis knelt among the scattered ruins of their sanctuary, cradling Astrid's battered head in her lap. Blood stained her grandmother's silver hair, and her breathing came in shallow, painful gasps. The sight of this woman, who had always seemed as eternal and unshakable as the mountains themselves, broken and bleeding on the floor of her own home, struck Freydis like a physical blow. "Grandmother, who did this? Who dared?" Freydis's voice broke on the words, tears streaming down her face as she gently touched the swollen bruises that marked Astrid's cheek and temple. Astrid's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but determined. With tremendous effort, she raised one trembling hand to point toward the door, where Magnus's silver arm ring lay like an accusation in the late afternoon light. The raven symbol carved into the metal caught the sun, proclaiming its owner's identity to all who could read the marks of nobility. "Eric's son," Astrid whispered, each word an obvious struggle. "Magnus," he found the letters. Before Freydis could ask what letters, the Longhouse filled with villagers. Bjorn, the blacksmith, arrived first, of his strong hands gentle as he helped assess Astrid's injuries. Behind him came Gunnar the shipwright, old Sven, who had fought in more battles than anyone could count, and Thorstein, whose farm lay closest to the Longhouse. The women followed Sigrid, the baker's wife, Ragnhild, who wove the finest cloth in 3 villages, and young Astrid's namesake, who had been born in this very room 19 years ago. They all saw the arm ring. They all understood what it meant. "By Thor's hammer," Gunnar breathed, his weathered face darkening with fury. "The Jarl's son has done this. Look at her," Thorstein said, his voice thick with outrage. "Look what he's done to our Astrid. This is beyond forgiveness." The crowd grew larger as word spread through Fjord like wildfire. Warriors who had been preparing their evening meal dropped everything and came running. Fishermen returned from their boats to find chaos in their peaceful village. By the time the sun touched the horizon, nearly every adult in the settlement had gathered either inside the Longhouse or in the space directly outside. Freydis remained on the floor, holding her grandmother, while Sigrid and Ragnhild worked to tend the worst of her injuries. Their faces were grim as they cleaned blood from wounds and felt for broken bones. The damage was extensive, ribs certainly cracked, possibly broken, a concussion that left Astrid drifting in and out of consciousness, bruises that would take weeks to heal. "She needs rest," Sigrid said quietly to Freydis. "And time, but she's strong. She'll survive this." "Surviving isn't enough," Freydis replied, her voice carrying a hardness that her friends had never heard before. "Justice is what matters now." From somewhere in the crowd, a voice called out the thought that was in everyone's mind. "The assembly horn must be blown. This cannot stand." The village assembly horn hung in the center of Fjord, near the great hall where Jarl Erik held court. It was an ancient instrument, carved from the horn of a massive aurochs and decorated with runes that spoke of justice and community decision-making. When it sounded, every adult in the village was obligated to gather and hear matters of importance. It had not been blown in anger for over 5 years. "I'll sound it," declared Gunnar, his hand moving to the axe at his belt. "Let's see how the Jarl explains his son's actions." "Wait," came a calmer voice from near the door. Einar the merchant, one of the most respected elders in the village, pushed through the crowd. His grey beard and measured manner commanded attention even in the midst of such chaos. "We must think carefully about what we're doing. Magnus is the Jarl's heir. Accusations against him cannot be made lightly." "Accusations?" Freydis looked up from her grandmother's side, her eyes blazing with a fury that made several warriors take a step back. "Look around you, Einar. Look at what he's done to this place. Look at what he's done to her. His arm ring lies there like a confession. What more proof do we need?" "Proof of what, exactly?" Einar's question was gentle but pointed. "We know Magnus was here. We know violence occurred. But we don't know why. We don't know what words were exchanged, what provocation might have—" "Provocation?" The word exploded from Freydis like a war cry. What provocation could justify beating a 60-year-old woman in her own home? What words could excuse destroying our sanctuary? The crowd murmured agreement, their anger building like a wave preparing to crash. These were people who had been healed by Astrid's hands, guided by her wisdom, comforted by her presence in their darkest hours. The attack on her felt like an attack on the very soul of their community. But Einar pressed on, his merchant's instincts warning him of the dangers ahead. "Magnus is not just any young man. He is the Jarl's son and heir. If we demand justice against him, we demand it against the ruling family. That path leads to bloodshed and division." "Then so be it," growled old Sven, hefting his walking stick like a weapon. "I've followed Erik Jarl for 20 years, but no leader is worth more than justice. No heir is above the law." "The law," Einar repeated carefully. "Yes, let's speak of law. What does our law say about accusations against nobility? What procedures must be followed? What evidence must be presented?" It was a sobering question. Viking law was complex, built on precedent and tradition rather than written codes. Accusations against common folk were straightforward, but charges against the Jarl's family required careful navigation of ancient protocols and political realities. "The assembly," said Thorstein firmly. "Whatever the law requires, it begins with the assembly. We call the village together, we present the evidence, we demand justice according to our ancient ways." "And if the Jarl refuses?" Einar asked. "If he protects his son? If he declares the evidence insufficient? What then?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Everyone in the Longhouse understood the implications. If formal justice failed, if the village's leadership protected Magnus despite the evidence of his crimes, then they would face an impossible choice between accepting injustice and taking justice into their own hands. "Then we'll cross that bridge when we reach it," Freydis said, her voice steady despite the tears that still tracked down her cheeks. "But we will not let this stand. We will not pretend it didn't happen. We will not let fear of consequences stop us from seeking what's right." She looked around the crowded Longhouse, meeting the eyes of neighbors who had become something more allies in a cause that would test everything they believed about loyalty, justice, and the bonds that held their community together. "My grandmother has given her life to this village," Freydis continued. "She has healed your children, eased your pain, guided you through your darkest hours. She has asked for nothing in return except respect and the chance to serve. Today, Magnus Eriksson repaid that service with violence and cruelty. If we do nothing, if we let this pass without consequences, then we are no better than the savages our enemies claim us to be." The crowd stirred, voices rising in agreement. The call for justice was becoming a demand, and the demand was becoming a war cry. Outside, the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed to echo the mood within the Longhouse. Soon, the assembly horn would sound. Soon, the village would gather to hear accusations that could tear their world apart. Soon, the fragile peace of Ironfjord would be tested by the ancient tension between loyalty to leadership and the demand for justice. But for now, in this moment of gathering storm, Freydis held her grandmother close and made a silent promise that would echo through everything that followed. Justice would be done, no matter the cost. The deep, resonant call of the assembly horn echoed across Ironfjord as the sun dipped below the western mountains, its mournful note summoning every adult in the village to gather in the great square. The sound carried with it the weight of ancient tradition and the promise of justice, or perhaps the threat of division that could tear their community apart. Jarl Erik emerged from his great hall with the measured stride of a leader who had faced countless crises. But those who knew him well could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand unconsciously moved to rest on his sword hilt. Beside him walked his wife Ingrid, her face a mask of controlled worry, and behind them, defiant and unrepentant, came Magnus. The sight of Magnus walking free while Astrid lay broken in her longhouse sent a surge of anger through the assembled villagers. He showed no sign of remorse, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. If anything, there was a smugness in his bearing that suggested he considered himself untouchable, protected by his father's position and his own future inheritance. Freydis stood near the front of the crowd, having left her grandmother in the care of Sigrid and the other women. Her eyes never left Magnus as he took his place beside his father. The contrast between them was striking. Where Erik carried himself with the dignity of earned authority, Magnus radiated the arrogance of inherited privilege. "Who has called this assembly?" Erik's voice carried clearly across the square, though everyone present knew he was well aware of the answer. "I have." Freydis stepped forward, her voice strong despite the emotional turmoil of the day. "I call for justice against your son, who has committed an unforgivable crime against my grandmother and our community." A murmur ran through the crowd, approval from some, concern from others. It was unusual for someone so young to initiate such proceedings, and almost unheard of for a woman to directly challenge the Jarl's family. But Freydis had the right under their ancient laws, and more importantly, she had the support of those who had witnessed the aftermath of Magnus's brutality. "State your accusation clearly," Erik commanded, his face revealing nothing of what he might be thinking. "Magnus Eriksson entered our longhouse without invitation and brutally attacked my grandmother," Freydis declared. "He beat her with his hands and with furniture until she lay bleeding and broken among the ruins of our sanctuary. He left his arm ring as evidence of his presence, showing no shame for his actions." She reached into her cloak and produced the silver arm ring, holding it high for all to see. The raven symbol caught the torchlight, its carved eyes seeming to stare accusingly at its owner. "This proves nothing," Magnus said, his voice carrying an infuriating note of boredom. "My arm ring could have been taken from me, planted in that hovel to support false accusations." The crowd stirred angrily at his dismissive tone, but Eric raised his hand for silence. "What do you say happened, my son?" Magnus smiled, and there was something coldly calculating in that expression. "I visited the wise woman to seek counsel about troubling dreams. She became agitated when I mentioned my concerns about certain influences in our village. She attacked me with surprising strength for an old woman, forcing me to defend myself. In the struggle, my arm ring was torn from my arm. I left immediately, not wanting to harm someone so revered, despite her unprovoked assault. The lie was smoothly delivered, plausible enough to create doubt in the minds of those who hadn't seen Astrid's injuries. But those who had been in the Longhouse knew better. The pattern of her wounds, the deliberate destruction of her sacred objects, the calculated placement of the arm ring all spoke to a planned attack, not a struggle in self-defense. "Lies!" Thorstein called out from the crowd. "I saw her injuries. No struggle could have caused such deliberate damage. The word of farmers against the heir of our Jarl." Magnus's voice dripped with disdain. "How convenient that my accusers are those who have always resented our family's authority." It was a clever move, turning the discussion from the crime itself to the motivations of those seeking justice. Several villagers shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to be seen as challenging legitimate authority. But others stepped forward, their loyalty to Astrid overcoming their deference to rank. "I delivered Magnus into this world," called out old Helga, the midwife whose hands had guided most of the village's births. "I knew him as a child, and I say this the boy I helped bring forth would never have done such a thing. But the man he's become?" She shook her head sadly. "That man is capable of anything." "The man I've become has been shaped by difficult truths," Magnus replied, his voice hardening. "Truths about those we're expected to revere without question." There was something in his tone that made Freydis's blood run cold. This wasn't just about the attack, there was something deeper, some revelation that had driven Magnus to violence. But what truth could justify beating an elderly woman? Eric studied his son's face with the careful attention of a leader who had learned to read men's hearts. Whatever he saw there didn't seem to please him, but he maintained his neutral expression as he addressed the assembly. "This is a serious accusation that requires careful consideration. The evidence must be weighed, witnesses heard, and judgment rendered according to our ancient laws. And until then," Freydis demanded, "Magnus walks free while my grandmother suffers. He returns to the comfort of the great hall while we tend her wounds." "My son is the heir to this jarlship," Eric replied firmly. "He cannot be imprisoned on accusations alone, no matter how serious." The crowd erupted in angry voices, some calling for immediate justice, others urging patience for proper legal proceedings. But through the chaos, one voice cut clearly, a woman's voice, weathered by age but strong with authority. "Let him come to me." Everyone turned to see Ragnhild approaching the square, her grey hair braided with the silver ornaments that marked her as a woman of substance. She was Astrid's older sister, a weaver whose skill was renowned throughout the northern settlements. Her presence commanded respect, for she carried the same wisdom as Astrid, but with a harder edge, forged by different experiences. "Aunt Ragnhild," Freydis said, surprise evident in her voice, "you shouldn't be here. You should be tending to grandmother." "Astrid sleeps now, her body fighting to heal itself," Ragnhild replied, her eyes fixed on Magnus with uncomfortable intensity. But before she lost consciousness, she spoke. "She told me things, old things, that perhaps should have remained buried." Magnus's confident demeanor wavered for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. The ramblings of an injured woman prove nothing. Perhaps not, Ragnhild agreed. But they explain much. Tell me, young Magnus, when you searched your father's belongings and found those letters, did you read them all? Or did you stop when your anger became too great to see clearly? The square fell silent, except for the crackling of torches and the distant sound of waves against the harbour rocks. Even Eric seemed caught off guard by his sister-in-law's words, his composed mask slipping to reveal genuine confusion. "What letters?" Eric asked, his voice carefully controlled. Ragnhild smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The letters your son found hidden in your chest, the ones that drove him to violence against my sister. The ones that speak of a winter 30 years past, when grief and loneliness brought two people together in ways that perhaps they shouldn't have been." The implications hit Eric like a physical blow. His face went pale as he understood what his son had discovered, what had driven him to such desperate action. The crowd sensed the shift in the Jarl's demeanor, the way his certainty crumbled in the face of this unexpected revelation. Magnus saw his father's reaction, and his own composure finally cracked. "Now you understand," he said, his voice raw with years of suppressed pain. "Now you see what your precious wise woman really is." But Ragnhild wasn't finished. From beneath her cloak, she produced a leather pouch that seemed to pulse with significance. "There are more letters, Magnus. Letters you didn't find. Letters that tell the whole story, not just the parts that feed your anger." She opened the pouch and withdrew a bundle of parchments, yellowed with age, but carefully preserved. "Would you like to know the complete truth, or are you content with the half-truths that drove you to beat an old woman?" The warhammer that Magnus wore at his belt, his father's gift, the symbol of his inheritance and the power that protected him, suddenly seemed less like a shield and more like a burden. The weapon that represented his authority over others had become a reminder of how that authority could be misused. As the torches flickered and the crowd waited in tense silence, the true reckoning was about to begin. The parchments in Ragnhild's weathered hands trembled slightly in the torchlight, each crease and fold telling stories that had been buried for 3 decades. The crowd in the great square pressed closer, sensing that whatever secrets those letters contained would reshape everything they thought they knew about their leaders, their wise woman, and the violent act that had brought them all together. "Before you read what was never meant for other eyes," Ragnhild said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through the events about to be revealed, "you must understand the winter those letters speak of. The winter of the great hunger, when the harvest failed and the fishing was poor, when children went to bed with empty bellies and strong men wasted away to shadows." Eric's face had gone ashen, his usual composure completely abandoned. He stared at the letters as if they were serpents coiled to strike. "Ragnhild, perhaps some things are better left in the shadows?" she interrupted, her tone sharp with decades of suppressed frustration. "Hidden like guilty secrets, while my sister pays the price for your inability to face the truth?" Magnus watched this exchange with growing confusion. The anger that had sustained him through the attack on Astrid was wavering, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. Whatever those additional letters contained, it was clear they told a different story than the one he had constructed from his partial knowledge. "Your father's first wife lay dying that winter," Ragnhild continued, addressing Magnus directly. "Svanna the Beautiful, they called her, and she was golden-haired and gentle, beloved by all who knew her. But the sickness that took her was slow and cruel, eating her away bit by bit while she remained aware of every moment of suffering." A murmur ran through the crowd. Many remembered Svanna, Eric's first wife who had died young, leaving him with grief and a village to lead through one of the harshest winters in memory. "My sister Astrid tended her through those final months," Ragnhild went on. "Day and night she sat beside Svanna's bed, brewing potions to ease her pain, mixing draughts to help her sleep. And Eric, broken by watching the woman he loved fade away, came to rely on Astrid, not just as a healer, but as the only person who truly understood his anguish. She held up one of the letters, its seal long since broken, its contents visible to no one but herself. "Would you like to know what this says?" "Magnus, would you like to read your father's words about how my sister saved not just his wife's life for as long as possible, but his own sanity during those dark months?" "I don't care about his gratitude," Magnus replied, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I care about what happened after she died." "Yes," Ragnhild said softly. "Let's speak of what happened after. When your father sat alone in his great hall, refusing food, refusing sleep, speaking to no one for days at a time. When the village needed leadership and found only a broken man who seemed determined to follow his wife into death. From her leather pouch, she withdrew another parchment, this one showing more wear, as if it had been read and reread countless times. This letter is from Astrid to Erik, written a month after Svana's funeral. Shall I read what it says? Erik stepped forward, his hand extended. "Ragnhild, please, my friend," she read aloud, ignoring his plea. "You cannot continue this way. Your people need you, your village needs you, and somewhere in the realm of the gods, Svana watches and grieves to see you destroying yourself. Come to the Longhouse tomorrow evening. Let me prepare food that you will actually eat. Let me brew something to help you sleep. Let me remind you that life continues and that you have duties to the living as well as obligations to the dead." The crowd listened in rapt silence, understanding beginning to dawn on their faces. This wasn't the tale of seduction and betrayal that Magnus had imagined. This was something more complex, a story of grief and healing, of two people trying to help each other survive the darkest time of their lives. "There are 17 more letters like this," Ragnhild continued. 17 invitations for a grieving man to share a meal, to talk through his sorrow, to remember that he was not alone in the world. "My sister took no lover that winter, Magnus. She took a friend who was dying of grief and helped him find reasons to live." Magnus's jaw worked silently, his certainty crumbling with each word. But he rallied, clinging to his anger like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. "And the other letters, the ones I found, the ones that speak of love?" Ragnhild's smile was sad and knowing. "Yes, Magnus. Love grew between them. How could it not? When two hearts share such pain, when two souls support each other through the valley of death, sometimes something beautiful emerges from that darkness. But it was not the base thing you've imagined." She withdrew the final letter from her pouch, this one sealed with wax that had never been broken. "This is the letter my sister never sent. Written in the spring, when Erik was ready to propose marriage, when their friendship had deepened into something that could have been wonderful." Would you like to know why she never sent it? The silence in the square was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as Ragnhild broke the ancient seal and unfolded the parchment. The words, written in Astrid's careful hand, seemed to glow in the torchlight. "My dearest Erik," she read, "by the time you read this, I will be gone from Iron Fjord. Not because I do not love you, for I do, with all my heart, but because I love you too much to let our happiness destroy your future. Your people need a jarl they can respect without question, a leader whose judgment they trust implicitly. If I become your wife, there will always be whispers about how I used the dark arts to snare you in your grief. There will always be doubts about whether your decisions come from wisdom or from a woman's influence. I will not be the cause of your authority being questioned. Find a good woman, Erik. Marry for alliance and strength, lead our people with honor. And perhaps, in time, remember our winter together not with guilt, but with gratitude for the healing we gave each other." Erik's composure finally shattered completely. He sank to one knee in the great square, his proud shoulders shaking with emotion he could no longer contain. The letters explained everything: why Astrid had suddenly left Ironfjord that spring, why she had stayed away for 5 years, why she had returned only after Erik had married Ingrid and established his household securely. "She sacrificed her own happiness for your father's honor," Ragnhild said to Magnus, her voice gentler now. "She walked away from love to protect his reputation. And 30 years later, you repaid that sacrifice by beating her nearly to death. Magnus stared at the letters scattered on the ground, his world rewritten by truths he had never imagined. The ring of confidence and righteous anger that had sustained him was gone, replaced by something that looked like horror at his own actions. But from another part of the crowd came a different voice, one that had been silent through the revelations, but now spoke with cold authority. Ingrid, Eric's current wife, stepped forward, her face a mask of controlled rage. "How touching," she said, her words like ice chips. "My husband's great love story, finally revealed. And where does that leave me, I wonder? Where does it leave our marriage, our children, our life together?" The political implications hit the crowd like a physical blow. If Eric's first marriage had been love and his second had been mere alliance, what did that mean for the stability of their leadership? What did it mean for the future of Ironfjord? The hidden scroll that contained these truths had indeed held the power to reshape their understanding of the past, but it was also threatening to destroy their present. Justice for Astrid might demand a price that none of them were prepared to pay. The tension in the Great Square had shifted from the question of Magnus's guilt to something far more dangerous, the stability of the very foundations upon which Ironfjord's leadership rested. Ingrid's words hung in the night air like the blade of an executioner's axe, threatening to sever bonds that had held the community together for 2 decades. Eric rose slowly from where he had knelt, his face aged years in the span of minutes. The man who had ruled with steady wisdom now looked uncertain, vulnerable in a way that made his followers deeply uncomfortable. A leader's strength was the village's strength, and seeing their Jarl shaken to his core left everyone feeling exposed to whatever storms might be gathering. "Ingrid," Eric began, his voice hoarse with emotion, "you must understand what Astrid and I shared ended long before I ever spoke to your father about marriage. Long before I ever looked upon your face with thoughts of alliance." Ingrid's interruption was sharp as a blade. "Of political necessity? Yes, Eric, I understood that from the beginning. I knew you married me to unite our settlements, to strengthen trade relationships, to secure our borders. I accepted that our marriage was built on practical foundations rather than romantic ones." She paused, her eyes sweeping the crowd that watched this intimate drama unfold in their most public space. "But I believed foolishly. It seems that over 20 years, through the birth of our children, through the building of our life together, something genuine had grown between us. I thought the man who shared my bed and my table and my worries had come to care for me as more than just a useful arrangement." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. This was the kind of private pain that should have remained within the walls of the Great Hall, but the events of the day had torn away all pretense of privacy. Every marriage in the village was built on some combination of love, necessity, and mutual respect, and seeing their leader's relationship exposed in its naked complexity forced everyone to examine their own bonds. Magnus watched his parents with growing horror, understanding that his attack on Astrid had unleashed consequences far beyond what he had intended. The silver arm ring that had seemed like evidence of his righteous anger now felt like a stone around his neck, dragging him down into depths he had never imagined. "Mother," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I never meant I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't want to know," Ingrid replied, turning her cold gaze on her son. "You found fragments of truth and wove them into a story that justified your resentment. You attacked an innocent woman because facing the complete truth was harder than striking out in anger." From the crowd, Freydis spoke for the first time since the letters had been revealed. Her voice carried a brittleness that suggested she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. "The reasons matter less than the result. My grandmother lies broken in her Longhouse, while we debate ancient history. Whatever drove Magnus to violence, justice must still be served." "Justice," Ragnhild repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, Let's speak of justice, not just for the attack on my sister, but for all the pain that has been caused by secrets and half-truths and the failure to face difficult realities. She moved to where several large stones marked the boundaries of the assembly area, ancient markers that had been placed by the first settlers of Ironfjord, carved with runes that spoke of unity and shared purpose. These clan alliance stones had witnessed countless gatherings, countless decisions that shaped the community's destiny. These stones have stood here for over a century, Ragnhild said, her hand resting on the weathered granite. They mark not just the physical boundaries of our assembly, but the spiritual boundaries of our community. They remind us that we are not separate families pursuing separate interests, but one people bound together by common cause. She turned to face the crowd, her weathered face stern in the torchlight. But what happens when that unity is threatened, not by outside enemies, but by the actions of our own leaders? What happens when the very people we trust to hold us together become the source of division? It was a question that cut to the heart of Viking society. Their communities survived through collective action, mutual support, and absolute trust in shared leadership. When that trust broke down, villages could splinter into feuding factions that destroyed themselves more effectively than any external enemy. I propose a test, Ragnhild continued, not just of Magnus's guilt or innocence, but of our community's strength. Let these alliance stones bear witness to a trial that will determine not just what happened today, but what kind of people we choose to be going forward. Eric straightened, his leader's instincts reasserting themselves despite his emotional turmoil. What kind of trial do you propose? Trial by combat? Came a voice from the crowd. Bjorn, the blacksmith, stepped forward, his massive frame and obvious strength making him an intimidating presence. Let Magnus face someone of Astrid's choosing in single combat. Let the gods decide who speaks truth. No, the refusal came not from Magnus or his parents, but from Freydis herself. I won't have my grandmother's justice decided by who can swing a sword harder. This isn't about strength, it's about what's right. Then what do you propose? Bjorn asked, clearly disappointed at being denied the chance to see Magnus humbled in combat. Freydis looked around the assembly, her eyes meeting those of neighbors who had become something more through the crucible of this crisis. She saw farmers and fishermen, craftsmen and warriors, young mothers and weathered elders. She saw people who had loved her grandmother and people who barely knew her, people who demanded immediate justice and people who counseled patience. Oh, I propose something harder than combat, she said finally. I propose truth, complete truth, witnessed by all, with consequences that we all agree to accept beforehand. Magnus laughed bitterly. You think the truth will somehow absolve me. You think admitting what I did will make it better. I think, Freydis replied carefully, that lies are what brought us to this point. Your lies about self-defense are lies about the past being buried and forgotten, the lies we tell ourselves about what we're willing to accept to maintain peace. She gestured toward the alliance stones, their carved surfaces seeming to pulse with significance in the flickering light. These stones represent the bonds between our clans, the agreements that let us live together despite our differences. But what good are bonds built on foundations of deception? You would risk everything? Einar the merchant asked. You would potentially destroy our community's unity for the sake of one woman's suffering? I would risk everything, Freydis confirmed, for the chance to build something stronger than what we have now. My grandmother taught me that healing sometimes requires cutting away infected flesh. Perhaps our community needs the same kind of surgery. The crowd began to murmur, some in agreement, others in concern. The idea of voluntarily exposing all their secrets, all their carefully buried conflicts, was both terrifying and strangely appealing. It offered the possibility of genuine resolution, but at the cost of destroying the comfortable illusions that had kept their peace. And if this trial reveals truths that tear us apart rather than bring us together, Eric asked, then we'll face that honestly too, Freydis replied. But I'd rather live with difficult truths than comfortable lies. Magnus stared at her with something that might have been respect mixed with fear. "You're willing to gamble everything on the hope that honesty will somehow fix what I've broken?" "I'm willing to gamble everything on the belief that you're not the only one who's been living with secrets," Freydis answered. "And that maybe, if we all face them together, we can become the community my grandmother always believed we could be." The Alliance Stones stood silent witness as the people of Ironfjord contemplated a choice that would determine not just Magnus's fate, but the very nature of their society. The comfortable certainties of the morning had been shattered, and what emerged from the ruins would depend on their courage to face whatever truths lay buried in their shared past. The decision to proceed with Freydis's trial of truth was reached not through formal vote, but through the gradual consensus that sometimes emerges when a community faces a crisis too large for normal solutions. As the crowd began to disperse with plans to reconvene at dawn, Ragnhild approached Erik with something that glinted silver in the torchlight. "Before we bare all our souls tomorrow," she said quietly, "there's one more secret that needs to see daylight." From around her neck, she lifted a delicate chain that had been hidden beneath her cloak. Suspended from it was an ornate pendant, clearly old, clearly valuable, and clearly familiar to Erik, based on the way his face went pale upon seeing it. "That's," Erik's voice caught in his throat, "that's my mother's necklace. The one she wore on her wedding day, the one that was supposed to pass to my bride." "Yes," Ragnhild confirmed, her fingers turning the pendant so its intricate Norse knotwork caught the light. "The one you gave to my sister 30 years ago, on the night before she left Ironfjord forever." Magnus, who had been preparing to retreat to the Great Hall, stopped as if struck by lightning. "He gave you grandmother's necklace? But that means your father considered my sister his true wife in all but law," Ragnhild finished. "That their love was so deep he bestowed upon her the most sacred symbol of his family's honor, the symbol that should have gone to his legal bride." The implications hit everyone present like a physical blow. Ingrid swayed on her feet, her face draining of color as she understood what this revelation meant. Not only had her husband loved another woman before their marriage, he had given that woman the family heirloom that was rightfully hers. "That's impossible," Ingrid whispered. "I received his mother's necklace on our wedding day. I've worn it for 20 years. Ragnhild's smile was sad and knowing. "You received a necklace, my dear, a beautiful piece, worthy of a Jarl's wife, but not the necklace. Erik had a copy made by the finest jeweler in the northern settlements, so skilled that even you couldn't tell the difference." Erik stood frozen, watching his carefully constructed life crumble around him. Every choice he had made for 20 years had been built on the foundation of this deception. Every time Ingrid had worn what she believed to be his mother's necklace, every time she had spoken of the honor he had shown her by bestowing it, he had remained silent and let her live the lie. Why? The word tore from Magnus's throat like a battle cry. Why keep it? Why give it to her if you were going to marry my mother anyway? "Because," Ragnhild said gently, "your father never stopped loving my sister, even after he married for alliance, even after he built a good life with Ingrid, even after he had children and grandchildren. Part of his heart never left that winter when two broken people healed each other." She turned to address the crowd that had stopped dispersing and was now listening with horrified fascination. "Do you want to know why Astrid really returned to Ironfjord 5 years after she left? It wasn't because she had gotten over Erik. It wasn't because she had found peace with their separation. From beneath her cloak, she withdrew another object, a small wooden figure, crudely carved but unmistakably depicting a child. She returned because she was carrying his daughter. The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of waves against the harbor rocks seemed thunderous. Magnus stared at the wooden figure as if it might transform into something less devastating, while Ingrid made a small, wounded sound deep in her throat. "That's impossible," Erik said, but his voice carried no conviction. She never had children." "She had one child," Ragnhild corrected. A daughter born in the settlement of Nordvik, where Astrid spent those 5 missing years. A daughter who lived just long enough to open her eyes and look upon her mother's face before the fever took her. Freydis felt the world shift beneath her feet. Are you telling me that my grandmother had a daughter with Eric? Yes. A child conceived in love and born in exile, who died before she could even be properly named. Ragnhild's voice was thick with old grief. That's why Astrid returned to Ironfjord. Not because she had moved past her love for Eric, but because she had nowhere else to mourn their lost child. The wooden figure in Ragnhild's hands had been carved during those long nights of vigil. A mother's desperate attempt to preserve some memory of the daughter she had barely known. Every curve of the tiny face, every fold of the miniature dress spoke to the depth of Astrid's love and loss. And Eric knew? Ingrid's voice was barely audible. Eric knew, Ragnhild confirmed. He knew why she left, he knew about the pregnancy, and he knew about the child's death. When Astrid returned to Ironfjord, broken and grieving, he welcomed her back, not as a former lover, but as the mother of his lost daughter. Magnus sank to his knees beside the Alliance stones, the full weight of his actions finally crashing down upon him. He hadn't just attacked the village, wise woman, he had beaten the mother of his half-sister, a woman who had sacrificed everything to protect his family's honor and had received nothing but pain in return. She could have demanded recognition, Ragnhild continued relentlessly. She could have claimed support for their child, could have used her pregnancy to force Eric's hand and break apart his planned marriage to Ingrid. Instead, she disappeared rather than cause political chaos, and when she returned, she dedicated her life to serving the community that had never known the depth of her sacrifice. The pendant swayed gently in Ragnhild's hand, its silver surface reflecting the torchlight like captured tears. This necklace represents more than a gift between lovers. It represents a promise that was made and kept in the only way possible, through decades of silent loyalty and hidden grief. Eric finally found his voice, though it came out broken and raw. How long have you known? I've known since the night she left Ironfjord 30 years ago, Ragnhild replied. I helped her pack, helped her plan her route to Nordvik, helped her write the letter that explained her departure without revealing the truth. And I've watched her live with that secret every day since. She turned to face Magnus, directly, her weathered features hard with controlled anger. Do you understand now what you've done? Do you comprehend the magnitude of the woman you attacked? She bore your father's child in exile rather than destroy his marriage. She returned to mourn that child in silence rather than seek comfort she was entitled to. She has spent 5 years serving a community that never knew what she had given up for their stability. Magnus tried to speak but found no words adequate to his horror. The righteous anger that had driven him to violence had been revealed as not just misplaced, but actively evil. He had punished the one person who deserved punishment least. The trial of truth, you proposed, Ragnhild said to Freydis, must include this revelation. Because Magnus's crime wasn't just assault, it was the destruction of a sanctuary built by a woman who had already sacrificed more than anyone should have to bear. Freydis stared at the wooden figure, understanding flooding through her, as she recognized features that echoed her own face, her grandmother's face. And now that she looked for it, something of Eric's strong jaw and steady eyes. She was looking at the carving of an aunt she had never known, a child who might have grown up to be her closest companion if the fever hadn't claimed her in infancy. This changes everything, she said softly. Yes, Ragnhild agreed. It changes everything. The question now is whether our community is strong enough to handle the complete truth, or whether some secrets are too devastating to bear. The necklace continued to catch the light, a symbol of love that had endured through separation, loss, and decades of silence. It represented the depth of connection between Eric and Astrid, but also the price that had been paid to preserve the community's stability. As the crowd finally began to disperse in stunned silence, everyone understood that the trial of truth planned for dawn would not be a simple matter of determining Magnus's guilt. It would be a reckoning with the hidden foundations of their society, an examination of what they were willing to sacrifice for peace and what they were willing to risk for honesty. The wooden figure and the silver necklace would bear witness to that reckoning, silent testimonies to love, loss, and the terrible complexity of human hearts. Dawn broke grey and cold over Fjord, the sky heavy with clouds that seemed to mirror the weight pressing down on every soul in the village. The night had passed without sleep for most, as families huddled in their longhouses, discussing in hushed whispers what the revelations meant for their community, their leaders, and their own carefully guarded secrets. Freydis had spent the dark hours beside her grandmother's bed, watching Astrid's labored breathing and gently cleaning the wounds that spoke to Magnus's brutality. Each bruise told a story of violence, but now those marks carried additional meaning. They were wounds inflicted on the mother of a lost child, on a woman who had sacrificed her own happiness to preserve the peace that Magnus's rage had shattered. "Grandmother," Freydis whispered as the first light crept through the longhouse windows, "can you hear me?" Astrid's eyes fluttered open, still unfocused but aware. Her voice came as barely a breath. "The trial, is it today?" "Yes, but you don't need to worry about that now. You need to rest, to heal." A ghost of a smile crossed Astrid's swollen lips. "Rest is for those who have finished their work, child. And I fear my work is far from done." With tremendous effort, Astrid raised herself slightly on the bed, where Sigrid and the other women had made her as comfortable as possible. Her eyes, though clouded with pain, held the same wisdom that had guided the village for decades. "Help me to the window," she requested. "I need to see what I've wrought." Freydis supported her grandmother's frail form as they moved slowly to where they could observe the village preparing for the trial. What they saw was a community transformed. Instead of the usual morning routines of fishing and farming, people moved with purpose toward the great square. But there was something different in their bearing, a solemnity that spoke to the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Near the great hall, Eric stood alone, his usual retinue of advisors notably absent. He held something in his hands, a shield that Freydis had never seen before, its surface polished to mirror brightness and decorated with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light. "That was my wedding gift to him," Astrid said softly, recognizing the shield even at a distance. "I worked on it for months, carving runes of protection and prosperity. I gave it to him the night before I left Fjord. The shield bore symbols, representing both vengeance and protection, its dual nature reflecting the choice that Eric would soon have to make. Would he protect his son, despite the evidence of Magnus's guilt, or would he choose justice over family loyalty? "He's kept it all these years," Freydis observed, noting how Eric's hands trembled as he traced the carved runes. "Some gifts become burdens," Astrid replied. "Some memories become chains that bind us to decisions we wish we could unmake." Across the square, Magnus emerged from the great hall, and Freydis was struck by the change in him. The arrogant young man who had strutted through the village like he owned it was gone, replaced by someone who moved like he carried the weight of mountains on his shoulders. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night, and when he looked toward the longhouse where they stood watching, his expression crumpled with something that might have been remorse. "He knows," Astrid said simply. "The truth has found him, as truth always does." "Will you forgive him?" Freydis asked, the question carrying the weight of everything that would happen in the coming hours. Astrid was quiet for so long that Freydis thought she might have fallen unconscious again. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the accumulated wisdom of 60 years of joys and sorrows. "Forgiveness isn't something I can simply decide to grant, child. It's something that grows slowly, like healing, like understanding. Today isn't about whether I can forgive Magnus. Today is about whether our community can forgive itself for the lies we've all lived with. The square was filling with people now, not just from Fjord, but from neighboring settlements as well. Word of the trial had spread during the night, carried by traders and travelers who understood that what happened here would have implications far beyond their single village. A community that could face such devastating truths and emerge stronger would be an example to others. A community that shattered under the pressure would serve as a warning. Ragnhild appeared at the Longhouse door, her face set with determination but her eyes soft with concern for her sister. "It's time, Astrid. The assembly is gathering." "I'm not strong enough to walk to the square," Astrid admitted with the practical honesty that had always marked her character. "Then we'll bring the trial to you," Ragnhild replied firmly. "If the mountain will not come to the wise woman, then the wise woman's family will move the mountain." It was a bold proposal, conducting the trial in the Longhouse rather than the traditional assembly area. But these were not traditional circumstances, and the symbolism was powerful. Here, surrounded by the healing herbs and sacred objects that represented Astrid's life of service, they would determine whether justice could coexist with mercy. "The Jarl will never agree to that," Freydis said. "It would mean admitting that grandmother's condition is more important than proper protocol." "The Jarl will agree," came Eric's voice from the doorway. He stood there with his shield in his hands, looking older than his years, but somehow more solid, more present than he had appeared in months. Because some things matter more than protocol. Behind him came Magnus, his face a mask of barely controlled anguish. When he saw Astrid lying pale and wounded on her bed, he made a sound that was part sob, part moan of despair. "Astrid," Eric said, his voice breaking on her name. "I'm so sorry. For all of it. For 30 years of silence, for the pain you've carried alone, for what my son has done to you." "And I'm sorry," Magnus said, falling to his knees beside the bed. "Not just for what I did yesterday, but for the anger I've carried, the resentment that made me capable of such cruelty. I thought I was avenging my mother's honor, but I was just striking out at someone who couldn't defend herself." Astrid studied both men for a long moment, her healer's eyes seeing not just their current remorse, but the long chain of choices and circumstances that had brought them to this point. "Apologies are a beginning," she said carefully, "but they're not an ending. The question isn't whether you're sorry, it's whether you're willing to do the hard work of making things right. Whatever that requires," Eric said immediately. "Whatever price must be paid for justice and healing, even if it means stepping down as Jarl," Astrid asked quietly. "Even if it means acknowledging that your family's leadership has been built on deception?" The question hung in the air like an axe blade. Outside, the assembled crowd waited for their leaders to emerge, unaware that the future of their community was being decided in the quiet sanctuary of the Longhouse. Magnus looked at his father, then back at Astrid. "If that's what justice demands," he said slowly, "then that's what we'll do. But first I need to face what I've done in front of everyone. I need to tell the truth about yesterday, about what drove me to violence, about the lies I told myself to justify the unjustifiable." Freydis felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of forgiveness. Magnus was no longer the arrogant young man who had destroyed their sanctuary. He was someone who had been broken by the truth and was trying to figure out how to build something better from the pieces. "The shield," Astrid said to Eric, gesturing toward the polished surface that reflected the morning light. "You've kept it all these years. Why?" Eric looked down at the weapon he held, his fingers tracing the runes Astrid had carved with such care and hope. "Because it reminded me of who I wanted to be, the man worthy of the woman who made it for me. I fell short of that ideal many times, but I never stopped trying to become worthy of it." "Then wear it today," Astrid said firmly. "Wear it when you face our community and tell them the complete truth. Let it remind you and them that justice and protection don't have to be enemies." As the morning light grew stronger, people began moving toward the Longhouse instead of the assembly square. Word had spread that the trial would be conducted here, in the heart of Astrid's sanctuary, and the symbolism resonated with everyone who had ever sought healing within these walls. Freydis helped her grandmother sit more upright, arranging pillows to support her back and placing a warm blanket around her shoulders. This frail woman, still bearing the marks of Magnus's violence, would serve as both judge and testimony in the reckoning to come. The shield in Eric's hands caught the light as he adjusted its position on his arm, the runes seeming to pulse with meaning. It represented everything they were fighting for, the possibility that protection and justice could coexist, that a community could face its deepest wounds and emerge stronger rather than broken. Soon, the Longhouse would fill with voices seeking truth and demanding justice. Soon, they would learn whether their bonds were strong enough to survive complete honesty, or whether some truths were too devastating for any community to bear. The trial was about to begin, and with it, the final test of everything they believed about family, loyalty, justice, and the courage required to build a society worthy of the best in human nature. The Longhouse had never held so many people, their bodies pressed together in a circle around Astrid's bed, as if she were the center of a great wheel whose spokes reached into every corner of their community. The air was thick with tension, and the mingled sense of unwashed bodies, fear sweat, and the lingering herbs that still clung to the damaged walls. Eric stood at the foot of Astrid's bed, the shield on his arm catching the morning light that streamed through the windows. Its polished surface reflected fragments of faces, worried mothers, angry warriors, curious children who had been told to stay home but had crept close enough to peer through doorways. The runes Astrid had carved so long ago seemed to pulse with significance, their ancient meanings suddenly urgent and immediate. "I call this assembly to order," Eric announced, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades of leadership, but also something new, humility, born of recent revelations. "We gather not in the traditional square, but in this sacred space, where healing has always been the highest law." Magnus stood beside his father, but there was no similarity in their bearing. Where Eric held himself with hard-won dignity, Magnus looked like a man preparing for execution. His hands shook as he reached for the leather pouch at his belt and withdrew an object that made several people in the crowd gasp. It was a sword, not his usual weapon, but an ancient blade whose origin everyone recognized. The judgment sword had been forged by the first settlers of Fjord, its steel folded with iron from meteors that had fallen from the night sky. Tradition held that truth could not hide when spoken in its presence, that lies would turn to ash on the tongue of anyone who tried to speak them while touching its sacred metal. "I claim the right of complete confession," Magnus announced, his voice barely steady. "I will speak the whole truth of what I have done, holding the judgment sword, and submit myself to whatever consequences this assembly deems appropriate." A murmur ran through the crowd. The right of complete confession was ancient, and rarely invoked. It meant that Magnus would forfeit all protections of rank and family, placing himself entirely at the mercy of community judgment. "Magnus," Eric said quietly, "you don't have to." "Yes, I do." Magnus's interruption was firm. Perhaps the first time in his life he had contradicted his father with complete certainty. "I have to face what I've done without the shield of your authority protecting me." He lifted the judgment sword with both hands, its weight far greater than any normal weapon. The blade seemed to drink in the light, its surface rippling like water as he raised it above his head. "I confess before this assembly, before the gods, before the woman I have wronged, that I entered Astrid's Longhouse yesterday with violence in my heart and lies in my mind," Magnus began, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I confess that I struck her down, not in self-defense, but in rage. That I beat a defenseless woman because the truth of my father's love for her was too painful for me to accept." The crowd listened in absolute silence, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a Jarl's heir, voluntarily abandoning every protection his birth had given him. I confess that my anger was not righteous but selfish, born not from love for my mother, but from fear that my inheritance was somehow diminished by my father's feelings for another woman. Magnus's hands tightened on the sword hilt, his knuckles white, with the strain of holding both the weapon and his composure. I confess that when I destroyed Astrid's sacred objects and scattered her healing runes, I was not punishing wickedness, but attacking the very goodness that has sustained our community for decades. From her bed, Astrid watched Magnus with eyes that held pain, but also something that might have been compassion. She had seen this young man grow from child to adult, had treated his childhood illnesses and blessed his first attempts at adult responsibility. The monster who had beaten her was real, but so was the boy who had once brought her wildflowers as payment for a remedy for his sick puppy. She said softly when Magnus paused, struggling with the weight of his confession. I confess that I left my arm ring deliberately, not as careless evidence but as a message. I wanted everyone to know what I had done. I wanted to force a confrontation because I believed. His voice broke, and he had to struggle to continue. Because I believed that destroying respect for you would somehow validate my anger. The judgment sword trembled in his grip, its ancient steel seeming to grow heavier with each admission. According to legend, the weapon would reject anyone who tried to speak falsehoods while holding it, but Magnus felt only the crushing weight of truth. I confess that my mother deserved better than a son who would use her memory to justify violence. I confess that my father deserved better than an heir who would attack the woman he loved to punish him for loving her. Tears streamed down Magnus's face now, but his voice never wavered. The crowd watched in fascination and horror as the arrogant young man they had known was stripped away, leaving someone raw and broken, but perhaps capable of becoming something better. Most of all, Magnus concluded, I confess that Astrid the Wise deserved better than to have her life's work of healing repaid with the very violence she has spent decades trying to cure in others. He lowered the sword, until its point touched the wooden floor of the Longhouse, then sank to his knees beside it. The confession was complete, and with it, Magnus had placed himself entirely at the mercy of the community he had wronged. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of wind through the damaged roof, where Magnus's violence had torn loose some of the thatch. Everyone understood that they had witnessed something remarkable, not just an admission of guilt, but a complete surrender of the pride and position that had made the crime possible. Now came the harder question. What justice looked like when the guilty party had already stripped himself of everything that had enabled his crime. The weight of Magnus's confession settled over the Longhouse like snow, heavy and transformative. For long moments, no one spoke, as if the community needed time to absorb the magnitude of what they had witnessed. A Jarl's son had not just admitted his crimes, he had systematically dismantled every defense that his birth and position had provided. Astrid shifted slightly on her bed, the movement sending ripples of attention through the crowd. Her weathered hand reached beneath her pillow and withdrew a small, smooth stone polished by countless years in a mountain stream, worn to perfect roundness by the patient action of water and time. This was given to me by my mother, she said, her voice weak but clear, and to her by her mother, and back through generations of wise women who understood that some things are more powerful than anger, more lasting than revenge. The blessing stone caught the light filtering through the Longhouse windows, its surface seeming to glow with inner warmth. Everyone in the room could feel its significance, though few could have explained exactly what that significance was. Magnus, Astrid continued, extending the stone toward him, you have spoken your truth with courage that your pride never would have allowed, but confession is only the beginning of healing, not its completion. Magnus looked up from where he knelt beside the judgment sword, his face streaked with tears, but his eyes clear for perhaps the first time in years. What would you have me do? How do I make amends for the unmendable? You begin, Astrid said simply, by understanding that justice is not always about punishment. Sometimes it's about transformation. She gestured for Freydis to help her sit more upright, though the movement clearly caused her pain. When she spoke again, her voice carried the accumulated authority of 6 decades spent guiding others through their darkest moments. You attacked me because you could not bear the thought that your father's heart held love for someone other than your mother. But love is not a finite resource that diminishes when shared. Your father's love for me took nothing away from his love for Ingrid, just as his love for both of us took nothing away from his love for you. Magnus flinched as if struck, but he didn't look away from her steady gaze. You destroyed my healing runes and sacred objects because they represented a wisdom you couldn't control, a power that existed outside your understanding. But wisdom is not diminished by being challenged. It grows stronger when tested by honest questions. From her position in the crowd, Ingrid stepped forward, her face pale but determined. Astrid, I need to say something. She paused, gathering courage, then continued. I spent last night hating you for the love my husband gave you. But this morning, listening to your words about love not being finite, I realize you've given me a gift. The crowd stirred with surprise, but Ingrid pressed on. You loved Eric enough to walk away from him, rather than destroy his future. You returned to mourn your daughter in silence, rather than demand recognition that would have shattered our family. You've spent years serving our community while carrying grief that would have broken a lesser person. Tears ran down Ingrid's cheeks, but her voice remained steady. I can't compete with the love you and Eric shared because it's not a competition. What you had was shaped by loss and sacrifice. What Eric and I built together was shaped by partnership and shared purpose. Both are real. Both have value. Eric stepped toward his wife, his shield catching the light as he moved. Ingrid, no, she interrupted gently. Let me finish. Magnus destroyed Astrid's sanctuary because he couldn't accept that our family's happiness might be built on complex foundations. But most happiness is built on complex foundations. Most love grows from tended ground, not pristine soil. She turned to face Magnus directly. Your crime wasn't just against Astrid, it was against the idea that families can be complicated and still be strong. That leaders can have human hearts and still be worthy of respect. Magnus absorbed these words like a man drinking after years in the desert. The blessing stone in Astrid's hands seemed to pulse with significance as she extended it toward him again. Take it, she said. Not as forgiveness that must be earned through action, not granted through gesture. Take it as a commitment to the hard work of becoming the man you could be, rather than remaining the man you were. Magnus's hand shook as he reached for the stone, its smooth surface warm against his palm. The moment his fingers closed around it, something shifted in his bearing, not absolution, but the beginning of genuine accountability. What would you have me do? He asked again. But this time the question carried different weight. It wasn't the desperate plea of someone seeking escape from consequences, but the honest inquiry of someone ready to accept whatever responsibility came with redemption. Rebuild what you destroyed, Astrid replied. Not just the physical objects, but the trust you shattered. Serve this community the way I have served it, not from a position of authority, but from a place of humility. She paused, gathering strength for what came next. And when you become Jarl, because despite everything, leadership is still your birthright and responsibility, remember this day. Remember what it feels like to hold power accountable to something greater than itself. The blessing stone grew warm in Magnus's palm, its ancient wisdom seeming to flow into him like healing balm. Around them, the community watched as something unprecedented unfolded, not just justice being served, but the possibility of transformation being offered to both perpetrator and victim. The Longhouse, that had been a sanctuary, then a crime scene, was becoming something new, a place where the deepest wounds could begin their long journey toward healing. 6 months after the trial, the first snow of winter dusted the rooftops of Fjord, transforming the village into something that seemed touched by magic. The Longhouse stood restored, its walls stronger than before, its shelves once again lined with healing herbs and sacred objects. But more than the physical structure had been rebuilt, the very spirit of the place had been renewed through months of careful tending by hands that understood the difference between restoration and mere repair. Magnus knelt on the wooden floor, where he had once scattered Astrid's healing runes, his calloused fingers carefully arranging new stones according to patterns she had taught him during the long months of his service. Each rune had been carved by his own hand, under Astrid's patient guidance, their symbols etched not just into stone, but into his understanding of what it meant to build rather than destroy. The protection rune goes beside the healing stone, Astrid instructed from her chair near the hearth, her voice stronger now, though she still moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body remembered violence. They work together. Healing without protection is vulnerable. Protection without healing is brittle. Magnus nodded, placing the stones with the reverence of someone who had learned that wisdom was earned through service, not inherited through blood. The blessing stone that Astrid had given him during the trial hung around his neck now, worn smooth by his constant handling during moments of doubt or anger when the old patterns tried to reassert themselves. "I still don't understand how you forgave me," he said quietly, not looking up from the runes. "I told you during the trial that I hadn't forgiven you," Astrid replied with gentle humor. "Forgiveness isn't a decision you make once. It's a choice you make repeatedly, day after day, as you watch someone work to deserve it." Through the window, they could see the village going about its winter preparations with a sense of purpose that felt different from before the crisis. The alliance stones in the great square had been recarved with new symbols, not replacing the old agreements, but adding to them, acknowledging that their community's strength came not from avoiding difficult truths, but from facing them together. Freydis entered carrying firewood, her movements confident and sure. The events of 6 months ago had changed her too, tempering her fierce loyalty with wisdom about when to fight and when to heal. She had become Astrid's acknowledged successor, though she would never simply replace her grandmother. Their community had learned that wisdom was not a crown to be passed on, but a garden that each generation must tend anew. "The council is ready to begin," she announced. "Eric and the other elders are waiting." Magnus rose from the floor, brushing stone dust from his knees. In 6 months, he had worked as a laborer, a servant, and a student, learning skills his birth had never required him to master. His hands bore calluses from construction work, his back ached from hauling stones, and his pride had been systematically rebuilt on foundations of earned respect, rather than inherited authority. "Are you ready?" Astrid asked him, and Magnus understood she meant more than just the immediate council meeting. Today, the village assembly would formally recognize Magnus as Eric's heir again, but under new terms that had been hammered out through months of careful discussion. He would inherit his father's position, but with it would come obligations that previous Jarls had never accepted: regular accountability to the community, formal limits on his authority, and a sacred duty to serve rather than rule. "I'm ready to try," Magnus replied, which was the only honest answer he could give. The council meeting took place in the Longhouse rather than the Great Hall, another of the changes that had emerged from their crisis. Important decisions would be made in the space dedicated to healing, surrounded by reminders that leadership was about mending rather than commanding. Eric entered with Ingrid beside him, their relationship visibly strengthened by the trials they had weathered together. The revelations about his past with Astrid had been painful, but working through them had created a deeper intimacy based on complete honesty rather than comfortable illusions. "The charter is ready," Eric announced, holding up a wooden tablet carved with symbols that would govern their community for generations to come. This was the new village charter that had emerged from their reckoning, not just a set of laws, but a statement of principles about how they chose to live together. The carved tablet represented everything they had learned about the balance between individual desires and community needs, between honoring the past and building the future. Its symbols spoke of accountability, service, and the revolutionary idea that power existed to serve rather than to dominate. Magnus stepped forward and placed his hand on the charter, feeling the weight of commitment settle on his shoulders. "I swear by the blessing stone and the alliance stones, by the healing runes and the judgment sword, to serve this community with the humility I have learned and the wisdom I hope to earn." Astrid watched from her chair, her healer's eyes seeing not just the young man making vows, but the network of relationships that supported and constrained him. Freydis stood ready to guide him when wisdom was needed. Eric remained present to share the burden of leadership during Magnus's learning years. Ingrid offered the steady counsel of someone who understood both the costs and rewards of partnership with power. "Then let it be witnessed and recorded," Astrid said formally, "that Magnus Eriksson accepts the responsibilities of future leadership earned through service rather than claimed through birth." The winter wind rattled the Longhouse walls, but inside, warmth radiated from the central hearth, where a fire burned steadily. The building that had once been violated by violence had become a symbol of renewal, its very existence proof that even the deepest wounds could heal when tended with patience and wisdom. As the formal ceremonies concluded and people began to disperse back to their homes, Magnus lingered beside Astrid's chair. The blessing stone around his neck caught the firelight, its smooth surface reflecting not just flame, but the possibility of redemption earned through persistent effort. "Grandmother," he said, using the title that had once seemed reserved for Freydis alone, but now felt natural for someone who had taught him to see beyond himself. "Yes, child?" Astrid replied, her voice warm with the affection that grew from watching someone transform themselves through their own choices. "Thank you for showing me that strength and gentleness don't have to be enemies." Astrid smiled, her weathered hands reaching out to briefly touch the blessing stone that had passed from her, keeping to his. "That wisdom was always within you, Magnus. You just needed to learn to listen for it above the noise of your own fears." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering Ironfjord in pristine white that would melt with spring's return, revealing whatever growth had taken root during the dormant season. The village slept peacefully, its people secure in the knowledge that their community had been tested and had not merely survived, but emerged stronger, wiser, more capable of facing whatever challenges the future might bring. In the Longhouse, 3 generations sat in comfortable silence. Astrid the Wise, who had sacrificed for peace, Freydis the Fierce, who had demanded justice, and Magnus the Reformed, who had learned that true strength lay in service. Together, they embodied the hope that each generation could build something better than what they had inherited, that love and accountability could coexist, and that even the gravest wrongs could become the foundation for lasting wisdom. The blessing stone pulsed gently against Magnus's chest, a constant reminder that redemption was not a destination but a journey, and that the most important battles were not fought with sword and shield, but with patience, humility, and the persistent choice to be better than one's worst impulses.